All right. Good morning, everyone. Karim Zuhri here from Cascade. I'm here today with Yaniv Bernstein, and we want to talk about work is not working and why. And I think just before we dig into the topic, I would like you, Yaniv, to introduce yourself and tell us more about your experience and where you are today.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Karim. Thanks very much for having me on the show. My name's Yaniv Bernstein. Until recently, I was the Chief Operating Officer at Airtasker. Now, until that COO role, I actually came from an engineering background. So computer science and software engineer. I spent 10 years at Google as a software engineer and engineering leader across different parts of the company, including YouTube, search, and Google Maps. And then moved into the startup world, first as the VP engineering CTO at Airtasker, where it was my job to run and grow the engineering team and really create a strong engineering culture. And then, like I said, most recently as Chief Operating Officer. I actually finished up at Airtasker last month, and I'm now off on my new adventure, which is about going on podcasts. Not really, not only. I'm actually looking at consulting and advising and coaching different companies in how they scale up. I also have a newsletter, which I publish an article on topics around organizational leadership, dynamics, and growth. That's called People Engineering. So I always love new subscribers. It's newsletter.peopleeng.com. And I'm also quite active on LinkedIn.
I can say that I've been reading a lot of your articles in this newsletter, and I align with a lot of these values. And I actually follow you also on LinkedIn. And that's how I convinced you to be part of this podcast. And thank you so much for being here, by the way. And I think one of the main reasons I reach out is because a lot of the statements that you share online or in the newsletter are actually things that I really believe in. And one of them is about the strategy, obviously, and the agility in organizations. Obviously, you have worked in large, amazing companies like Google, and you have mentioned many brands of Google, but also smaller companies that grew very fast and are very successful, like Airtasker in Australia. So if you want to talk about this, if you want to talk about strategy and work is not working, but also the agility, what's your point of view on this?
Sure. So strategy is one of those terms that I think has been quite badly corrupted to the point that it's considered a corporate buzzword, which is a real pity because strategy is absolutely critical to success in any human endeavor, I believe. Now, the reason the term has been so corrupted is that people take a bunch of vague statements and call it their corporate strategy. That's not what a strategy is. My favorite book on strategy is Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt. And he talks quite specifically about what makes a strategy a strategy. And really, it needs to start with a diagnosis of the problem that you're trying to solve, then a general approach to how you're going to solve that problem, and then feeding that down into a specific set of actions that follow that approach for solving the problem. And so a strategy is actually quite a concrete thing. It is high level, but it is concrete. Now, the reason I mentioned strategy in the context of agility, agility is another thing that has gotten a very bad name. And that's because similarly, it's been surrounded by people who I guess have figured out how to make money out of it, turned it into a buzzword without really understanding the underlying principles of agility. And instead it's become just a new set of cumbersome processes. Now, what agility is really about, it's about having a certain level of humility where you understand that you cannot predict how your product will be received, what the future will look like, that forecasting in the modern world is effectively not feasible. And therefore you need to be constantly taking feedback from the market, from how your product gets used, and taking that and reincorporating it into the product. To me, that's what agility is at its core. Now, the connection here is if you're going to use an agile process that really allows you to incorporate feedback and make a lot of decisions close to the team level at a rapid cadence, what you need is a lot of very good context on what it is that you as an organization are trying to achieve. And the most important bit of that context, or at least one of the most important pieces, is the strategy, right? If you do not know what problem you're going to solve, then it's very hard to be agile in solving it.
I love it. So I think you spoke about a lot of very important concepts here. The first one is strategy is concrete. And a lot of people give this excuse of saying, I'm building strategy. And then when you realize, when you ask them exactly what they are doing, they are just building plans and building dreams and building ideas that sometimes don't get even concretized or not even feasible. I love what you said about agility as well. And it's the humility that you have in agility. And humility comes here when you say that I'm building stuff and I will learn over time. Does not mean that I'm gonna change my mind every single week on what I'm building next, because there's a context that you just mentioned, which is coming from the strategy. So maybe my next question is, what is the difference between agility and strategy?
So yeah, it's a good question. And I would say that, you know, when people talk about strategy, they also talk about tactics, right?
Yep.
So strategy is your overarching, you know, you could say it's the North Star, or a strategy is something that shouldn't change particularly often, right? You have a destination in mind and a general approach to reaching that destination. But what you do day to day to reach that destination, that is tactics, right? That is about understanding the conditions on the ground. And your tactics should actually be agile. And, you know, I think a lot of the thinking on strategy and whatnot does come from a military background. And I do actually occasionally read books on military strategy and, you know, written by military leaders, because I think that there is this view of the military as being very structured and regimented, but actually modern militaries are very adept at taking this sort of high level strategic view, but then being very agile on the ground, because you do not know what's going to happen when you're in the heat of battle. And I think that's very much true in software as well. So agile is about knowing what your overall goal is, but then reacting to the conditions on the ground and not just sort of going ahead with a plan that is obsolete as soon as it actually makes contact with reality.
Absolutely. So if you mix all this together, maybe now, what is a bad strategy and what is a good strategy in terms of ingredients? Is it all about the agility or the process? Is there anything around the culture that we want to talk about, or the people, or how do you enable people to make these decisions, and like the entire decision making process, maybe at all levels? What is your take on this?
Sure. Yes. Well, first of all, you know, a bad strategy is about appearances, right? I think a lot of companies, you know, have a strategy that is designed to look good or sound lofty. And if you say our strategy is to be the market leader that's serving our customers with the best possible product, well, that's not really a strategy, right? Because you're not talking about the problem you're solving or what your unique approach or specific approach is to solving the problem. So a bad strategy is something that's designed to look good, whereas a good strategy is something that is designed to inform decision-making and inform actions. Now, when you mention culture, yes, I think that's a very good call out, because fundamentally translating strategy to action through agile processes sits on a very critical foundation of culture. And that foundation is one about empowering individual teams and giving them the context to make those decisions on the ground. You know, Netflix is one of the companies that I really admire in terms of their thinking on culture.
Yep.
And the thing that they say that really resonates with me is they talk about leading with context and not control. So that means you don't tell people what to do. You tell people what it is that you as an organization are trying to achieve, and what their part is in achieving that. So that means that that team, who by definition are going to know the most about the area in which they are working, they have all the context they need to make the right decisions as new information becomes available. And so translating that strategy into reality in that agile way requires actually a massive investment in culture and the right sort of process. A lot of the things that we talk about, and probably where a lot of agile transformations go wrong, is that there is an attempt to change the process without changing the underlying culture. And if you do that, you will fail.
Absolutely. I think leading with the vision and not with the control is one of the most important things I learned in my life, is that you can never tell people what to do because you have no idea how to do them or how to start or where to start them, because you are pretty far from the ground at a leadership level. And actually, you should not be telling them how to do something. But if you tell them about the vision or the direction that the company should be taking, and give them enough context on why we're going to that direction, people get motivated, people understand the challenge, and then they just go and execute in the most effective way. If you show them the direction and obviously the goals that we're trying to achieve, it's a completely different culture than the one that is controlling and micromanaging. I remember once reading an article from me about leaders versus managers, but also the insider and the outsider leader. And I think this may be aligned very well with what you were just saying in terms of control and context. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I actually think it was Steve Jobs who said, he has a reputation as being very top down, but there's a quote from him where he says, "I don't hire smart people to tell them what to do. I hire smart people so they can tell me what I should do." And I think that's absolutely right. And I think, being an insider leader, what I call an insider leader, is when you are a part of the team. You're not outside of the team telling them what to do. You are inside of the team, giving the team what they need in order to be successful. And absolutely, it's, we're working in a knowledge economy. You have all of this human capital, all of this intelligence at your disposal. And if you tell people what to do, you're wasting a vast proportion of that. And it's ineffective and inefficient to have a small group of leaders telling people what to do.
I like it. I really like it. I think I've been talking about one thing recently with the team about like innovation and success as a company. And I always talk about the big four with the team. And every time I say the big four, they go, "We're not talking about these big four consulting companies. Why are we bringing this up again?" Because we are all about kind of like the concrete part of the strategy. And I say, no. The big four are about four important things that any company need to have: the ideas, the team, the execution through the process, but also the timing. And if you align these big four together, you can do incredible stuff. So I think with that in mind, I wanted to ask you about kind of the process of success, or like, is there anything that you can share with the audience here about how to be successful as a company and as a team, and where agility plays, where does strategy play, where does culture play, and how do you combine all of these ingredients maybe into one recipe that you want to share with the team about success and growth at the same time? It's a very long question, but hopefully I was able to summarize at the end.
It's a long question and a difficult question, and I hate to disappoint you and your listeners. I don't think there is a recipe for this. I think it is situational. But what I would like to say is that it really does come back down to that context and that really understanding what it is that you are trying to achieve as an organization. I actually gave a seminar last week on leading commercially, right? And what does it mean to lead commercially? That means understanding the constraints under which you're operating and understanding what your goals are. And so really, I think by far the most challenging thing is to get everybody aligned around what it is important to achieve. And, and you mentioned timing, right? I think sequencing, the order in which you do things is super critical.
Yeah.
Right. So really, as a leader or as anybody within a company, the important thing to do is to understand that there are no prizes out in real life for working hard or, being productive in terms of outputs. It is only outcomes that matter. And so to me, a culture of curiosity and of inquiry, and of really making sure that every person understands why they are doing what they are doing and takes ownership of that the thing that they are doing is the most valuable possible thing that they could be doing for the organization right now. That is the key to success. And I think as a leader, it really is around that creation of culture. And if you create the right culture, then the rest of it should look after itself.
Amazing. I think I'm going to park the outcome conversation and ownership to the end because I'm very passionate about it. And you mentioned a lot of things like the productivity and the output in there. And I want to talk a lot about this. But before that, and I think I have a question that I cannot ask anyone else than you on this podcast, which is when it comes to timing. When we talk about timing, there's a sequence of things, and that is extremely important from engineering perspective, but also from go-to-market perspective. And I think you have experienced both of them as a CTO and a COO. So maybe my question is, what is your advice as a CTO to COOs? And what is your advice as a COO to CTOs?
Goodness.
What would you change? What would you change in the way they approach things when it comes maybe to the timing concept, or even broader than just timing? Things that you have learned from COO that you wish you knew when you were a CTO, and the opposite as well.
Yes. So I think from the advice from a COO to a CTO, I'll start there, is really to make sure that you understand your customers and understand the broader context of the business. I think one thing that's very easy for engineers in general to fall into, and I think it can happen at the leadership level too, is to get overly excited by technology for its own sake. And that makes sense because the best engineers and the best engineering leaders are people who love technology and enjoy what it can accomplish. But as always, it is within a broader context. And understanding that context is really critical. So you talk about like go to market and say delivery schedules, right? Now, we're also in the broader context of agility. So in general, you don't want to commit to a particular date unless you have to, because there's too much that's unknown. However, especially if you're in an enterprise business where you have contracts or customers who expect things at certain times, it's necessary to deliver. So I think building that trust from the CTO to the COO and understanding, what is genuinely a deadline, what is an approximate timeline, what are the general commercial priorities here, right? Is it more important to deliver something on time or wait until you've got market validation? All sorts of things like that. So really understanding why you're building what you're building, and that will allow you to make the right trade-offs.
Amazing.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to go in the other direction. So from a CTO to COO, it really is understanding the engineering processes and understanding a little bit about the trade-offs that are being made, right? So because software, obviously, it has the surface and then it has this gigantic mess of infrastructure underneath it that presents all sorts of constraints and trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And for a COO or anybody, any peer of engineering, really, to understand a little bit about what it is that makes the art and science of creating software challenging, and what the different trade-offs are when making engineering decisions. I think it's really important. If you treat it as a delivery function, you will be disappointed. If you treat engineering as a partner, then you will be really successful.
I love this. I think it all goes back to empathy. And empathy, when you spoke about the COO, is about empathy to understanding the customer and the problems, but also empathy to the engineering challenges that we face every day. And they sometimes seem much more simple from the outside if we don't know enough about what's going on, and the scaling challenge, the technology challenge, but also the delivery challenge sometimes that we can face as companies, especially in tech.
It's actually great you mentioned empathy, because I actually agree that's at the core of most of these things. And when I talk about context, the scary thing, but also the great opportunity when you look at most human organizations is how quickly, even though you're all actually trying to achieve the same thing, it can start to feel like there's us and them and different groups within that, right, that are not necessarily aligned. If you're able to share the context to get everybody aligned and pointing in the same direction, and seeing other people's problems or other functions' problems as something where you should come in and help rather than get annoyed about, that is when you succeed. And empathy comes from sharing context and information.
I love it. I think another topic here is alignment. And I think just before we speak about alignment, I don't know if it's just Zoom on my side or not. Obviously, we are live and we are in lockdown, so we're recording on Zoom. Your video is frozen. So I don't know if you want to just turn off and turn on your camera again and see if this will change anything. But I think at this point, the question of alignment is becoming more and more important, because when you think about a company and when you think about it from departments and you and us, as you said, this alignment becomes harder and harder every day. But if you mix alignment with strategy and with culture, and when you said just earlier, which is outcome, you can build an incredible company and you can avoid anxiety from some people. You can also avoid some people from leaving because they don't believe in the vision that you at the start did not even share with them or expose at the first place. So maybe to wrap things up, let's talk about the outcome culture and how can you make work for everyone in the company, whether it is departments talking to each other, whether it is leaders and team members, whether it is anything else. So maybe we should wrap up about how to make work in some ways.
For sure. And by the way, you know, the premise and the reason I named my newsletter People Engineering is precisely because of this, right? That when you're building an organization, what you're actually doing is you're creating a system, which is quite a complex system or organism where the whole is much more than the sum of its parts. And so making sure that all of these different departments or functions and individuals are actually working together in harmony rather than at loggerheads or just inefficiently in parallel is really at the core, I think, of leadership. Now, in terms of how to make work and focusing on outcomes, I think there's another word that comes into this, which is trust, right? The other thing that I see that can become dysfunctional is an overemphasis on KPIs, for example, or on very specific metrics. Now, I think metrics are incredibly important as a diagnostic, right? You want to have a lot of metrics to understand how your business is going, how your product is going. Otherwise, you're flying blind. But the idea that you need specific numbers to measure how people are going when you have an unknowable future, I think is wishful thinking and causes a lot of harm. So again, it comes down to culture. And what you want to do is have everyone understanding what success looks like, what the strategy is, what your objectives are. You want to have those metrics and you want to measure people's performance in whatever ways you can. But ultimately, it's really important to say, okay, we trust you that you're working here and you want to be successful and you want this company to be successful. And therefore, we're making it clear to you the sorts of outcomes that we are looking for, the role that you play. And we give you the tools and the context to pursue those things. But we're not going to make things too narrow and too tight because that's going to create perverse incentives. And so I think it's actually very difficult, ironically, to have an outcome-based culture if you make everything about KPIs. You have an outcome-based culture if you are focused on customers, if you're focused on objectives, and if you're focused on value.
Amazing. I think it is interesting that we talk and talk and talk, and at the end we come back to like 4 or 5 very simple words that would make anyone look at the world very differently. The first one is communication, whether it is the context where it is just exposing what you're trying to do or the outcomes. That's the first one, is communication. The second one is just trusting. And giving the trust by default and not making people earn it is the second piece. And I think the third one is just aligning people and have them focus on the right things at the right time can actually change, can move, let's say, can move mountains in some ways for companies. And we keep forgetting about the basics that we hear about maybe for 40, 50, 60, 70 years of industries that have been shaping up today to the world that we are right now.
Absolutely. I think there is this sort of false precision, this again, I call it wishful thinking, because there's this idea that you create this sort of machine with predictable cadences and predictable outputs and predictable outcomes, and that's what management is. That's very industrial age, and now we're in the knowledge age. And as much as we wish that we had this predictable system, we simply don't. And so using management techniques that work well for a predictable system on an unpredictable system is just going to lead to bad results. And yes, so as you say, you go back to these much more human-centric ways of leadership, not because even, that's more humane and compassionate, although it is, but that's because it's the only way to really run an organization, a knowledge organization, successfully.
Amazing. I think we can have maybe a second and third episode for sure in the future. But maybe to finish, do you have any wish to share with the world and the people working and leaders to inspire us all with what you think?
I'm going to pause for a moment and actually
let's close our eyes.
Response.
Let's close our eyes.
I wish that people would ask why more often.
I love this. I think, the why is missing. The why is missing in many, many ways, whether it is at work or in life. We don't question the why of things. We always tend as human to go to the what and the how do I do something, rather than asking why am I doing it. And I think we can talk about it for hours. So let's not start here. And thank you so much for your time today. And I'm really looking forward to maybe another episode with you, Yaniv, in the future.
Okay, thanks, Karim. I love that.
Thank you so much.